Okay, let's talk about writing leads, the data explanation, how we explain our data, and how we attribute both data and sources. So if you recall, right, the Pell Grant data that you worked with, this is a press release that was actually issued by the Education Trust. What's interesting is here is this press release, and take a look at this lead, right? So that is just on its face. What bothers you about that? It is so long. This is a really long lead, right? 125 words, 4 sentences. We have taught you better than that. So I think that this is way too long. You know, press releases come in all forms. I mean, you know, you see stories in all forms. But several recent reports have estimated a significant gap in college completion rates for low-income students who receive federal Pell Grants and other college students, leading some to question the effectiveness of this investment of taxpayer dollars. But according to a new report in the online data tool released today by the Education Trust, the average graduation gap between Pell and non-Pell students at the institutional level is actually much smaller, only 5.7 percentage points. And more than a third of four-year colleges and universities have even smaller gaps or no gaps at all. These data deliver a powerful blow to those who question whether taxpayer dollars are being wasted and whether most low-income students are even capable of completing college. I would say that you could cut right to, you know, this last little bit here and make a much more compelling story. But that's why we're going to write shorter leads, right? So let's take a look at, this is another award-winning story. This was the student category. It was, albeit done by a grad school, right? The City University of New York grad school. And so it's about cafeteria inspections in New York City public schools and the violations that they encountered. So this is one paragraph that could be a lead, right? Nearly 700 school cafeterias, about half of the approximately 1,400 inspected by health officials in 2017, received at least one critical violation, which indicates the kinds of problems that could lead to foodborne illness. Now that's the kind of findings you might have from your data, right? So you might have these numbers that say, look, this is what I found. Nearly 700 school cafeterias, approximately 1,400 inspections, at least one critical violation. That's putting some information out there for the reader to take in, right? This has some impact. So would you use that for a lead, or would you use this? At Public School 398 in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, elementary school students were offered a lunch of beef patties, zucchini, and pears on March 20th. A city health inspector discovered some unappetizing conditions in the cafeteria and the kitchen that day. Live roaches, close to 600 fresh mice droppings, all conditioned primed to cause illness. So what do you think? I'm thinking this one, right? Because this gets us there and it tells us this is what happened at this one time, at this one school. And then we can add the context a little later with this paragraph and a few paragraphs that says, look, this is how many times this sort of thing happened. So we care about people. We care about this specific incident. The numbers are important, but they help us put in context this one story that represents many other stories. So think about that when you're writing. Further in the story, we get into the people, right? Because it's got to be about the people. More than 24 students interviewed at some of the schools hit with the most violations said they avoided eating in cafeterias because of bad quality food or cleanliness concerns. So they interviewed more than 24 students, right? Which is a lot, and it's not a lot. There are thousands and thousands of kids in those schools, but they didn't quote all of the 24 students that they interviewed. They quoted the best ones, the ones that had the most compelling stories. But the idea is that we have to often interview many more people than we will use in our story. But that means that if I've interviewed 24 students, Angel's story here, I know that I can trust Angel's story. It seemed like a compelling story when he told me. All these other students also backed up and had similar stories, so I'm going to bring you a few of those stories. And I'm telling you that I interviewed a bunch of people here, right? So Angel Rosario, 17, recalled becoming queasy after eating mozzarella sticks from the school cafeteria in the Urban Assembly Bronx Academy of Letters in Mott Haven. He said his family took him to a doctor who diagnosed food poisoning. So here we introduce Angel, right? So this is our sort of routine system of writing. We have a paraphrase. Here's information that came from him, right? So we don't have to say he said it because we've got, here's what happened when we're going to presume that came from him. So we introduce him, and we're going to keep going with more information from him, a more traditional paraphrase. Rosario said he did not report his illness to the school. He didn't think his experience was unusual. Now he rarely eats in the cafeteria. And so we've got these two paragraphs setting up this quote so that now we expect this quote to be from Rosario, right? So paraphrase, then into the quote. I used to just sit there and wait until lunch was over, said Rosario, now a senior. Sometimes I didn't eat. I waited until I got home. It made my stomach hurt and it made me go home cranky. So all of this information leading up to this quote helps give life to the story. And here's a little added bonus. They actually took this quote and used the audio clip from the interview and just put that in the story. So that's a nice touch that we can do. We like multimedia elements and we like photos so we can see who this person is. That helps us understand and believe him. So let's take a look at how we're going to attribute some of these sources. So sources we interviewed by email or by video conference, probably, because that's where we are at this point in the semester, right? It's a little bit of an unusual semester. So emails really aren't interviews, right? That's really the thing, but they are acceptable under these circumstances. And so the key will be to ask some good questions. You may have to go back and forth a bit and to try to pick the answers that don't sound so like formally written, right? Like you really want to help somebody get at what they're trying to tell you. And the best case would be you get some answers by email and you say, you know, could I call you and talk to you a little bit about this? Because that's when you can really hear somebody's voice. But if you've got an email interview, you might just say Rosario said, right? But it's really better if you let us know it was an email. So Rosario said in an email. And you might explain why you had to do an email interview, right? And you're not going to use first person. You're going to say he was interviewed by email because of the current request for people to stay indoors, right? Rosario said in an email in response to questions sent to him for this story. So all these are acceptable ways to credit somebody who gave you information in an email. Now, you might video conference, FaceTime, or phone call with them. So I really like video conferencing or FaceTime because being able to see the person, you know, you don't get the same rapport as if you're sitting next to them, but you do get some rapport and some accountability, right? When you can look somebody in the eye, that really helps. So in that case, Rosario said in an interview over FaceTime or over a video conference. Rosario said during an interview over Skype. So it just gives you that sense of this is how we talk to him. And you might, if you do it over a video conference, you might record a little snippet of it, right? And include that with your story. But do pay attention to not only what you include, but also the style. Remember said, we like said, that's our attribution word. Now, we also are sort of relaxing a little bit the requirements for the types of sources that we're going to use in the project this year. So if you need to have 3 sources, right? We've talked about that, 3 sources. Our preference is that they be interviews. And then you bolster it with some of this other material, but we are going to work with you on this across the board, right? So the main thing is to produce a good story and for you to stay safe. So if you're going to use a credible website or say research, this is how you would attribute that, right? According to a statement from Austin Tenants Council, and then you would link to that. Or according to research by Professor Sandra Ikigami, and then you would link to the research. According to a report issued by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? So it's basically you're going to quote from a report, you're going to paraphrase from the report, but you need to tell us where it came from. Or say that you're going to use something from another media source. Again, generally we try to avoid that, but we're okay with that this time. Or from a press release. And sometimes that's the only way you can get a hold of some people who are important to a story is by a press release or when they talk to another media source. So, for example, Governor Greg Abbott told the Austin American-Statesman, or Governor Greg Abbott said in a press release issued by his office. So you're going to paraphrase some information from him, use a quote from him, but each time you use his name, you need to let us know, particularly in the quote, this did not come from you interviewing him. It's a quote, and Greg Abbott said in a press release, or Greg Abbott told the Austin American-Statesman in March. Really, really important. Think about it this way. If we're talking about people, we generally use said, right? Or he told the Austin American-Statesman. So people said, websites, reports, things that are static, right? That are not people, right? So inanimate objects. Reports, websites, that's according to. I really like that style better, according to. And here's the key, right? Journalism ethics and academic honesty. Those are the principles at play here. If you fail to attribute a quote taken from another source, that is plagiarism. If there's a quote in your story and it just said Abbott, I am going to assume you interviewed Greg Abbott. And I'm going to wonder, did you really interview Greg Abbott? So proper attribution is critical. Readers really need to be, our audience needs to believe what we're giving them. And all we have is our credibility, right? So don't get caught with this. So how do you attribute the data? Also really important, right? So we've got all this data we're going to use, and we can't just throw it in there. So you might say, according to data from the Education Trust. So you remember the Pell data came from the Education Trust. There was a report according to data from the Education Trust, and you link to the report, right? According to data from the Education Trust Pell Partnership Report, another way. But you only need to link back to the original source material once, right? Like if you mention it several times, you know, in second reference, you might say the report or the Education Trust report or the partnership report, but you only need to link back to it one time. And according to an evaluation of Pell Grant data from the Education Trust would be one more way you could do that, right? It's also really important for you to explain your data, you know, how you got to where you are and how you got these numbers. So take a minute and write a sentence or two explaining how you obtained and evaluated the Pell Grant data, right? So at least do this in your mind. Think about this, no first person. It's not about I did this. You need to write in news style. And so you can think about according to the Pell Grant data, but how are you going to explain this is what I did with the data? Okay. How about this? Pell Grant data available from the Education Trust was analyzed to determine, which schools have the highest, which schools have the highest percentage of Pell recipients. So that would be one way to say, like, here's where I got the data, here's what I did to analyze it. If we look back at that big use of force graphic, we are going to give people data in so many different ways, but we need to make it simple for them and we need to make it compelling, right? Simple so they can understand it and compelling. This is a little crazy. You're not going to do this, but it is kind of beautiful if you want to click on it and check it out. All right, up next, writing for visuals, headlines and captions.